Okay, great. Reid, I am thrilled to be sitting down with you. You are the one person that we would never be able to host a good AI event without. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure that the audience knows more about you than I could ever describe. Entrepreneurship, incredible investor, strategist, podcaster, helping civil society by helping us win the most recent election. So thank you for all the work that you do. The one area I think that might be really interesting for the audience to hear about is your background is specifically as it relates to the field of AI. And I'd love it if you could tell us when you first got interested in the field of AI and how you got interested and how it's impacted the time that you spend and the priorities in your life. Because I know there's a lot of priorities for you. So it takes a lot for something to pull you in that direction.
So first, as an undergraduate, my advisor gave me a great piece of advice, which is read through the Stanford Courses and Degrees book and circle all the courses I must take before graduating. And one that you took that I didn't, which is visual thinking, which was also circled, led me to thinking about doing artificial intelligence as a major. I ended up doing this major at Stanford called symbolic systems. And it was because I'm most curious about who we are as thinking and speaking beings. How do we understand each other? How do we reason? How do we discover truth? What is the life we should be leading? And how do we get to understanding that, communicating, collaborating, et cetera? And so I was like, okay, symbolic systems as an undergraduate, then went to Oxford as a graduate student of philosophy, still trying to figure out what thought and language was, ultimately concluded that no one really knew what thought and language was, and AI systems at the time wouldn't really amount to being anything other than toys. And so went into entrepreneurship, creating networks of how you redefine societies of human beings through the kind of the software of human networks, unlike the more hard tech hard networks that you were doing at a kind of at an earlier stage. And then got dragged back in because I was actually having dinner with Elon. And Elon said, well, you know a lot about AI. And I was like, well, I used to, right? He's like, there's important things happening. You need to get involved. And I was like, really? It's like, yes. I was like, all right. And so I started digging at it. And I realized that a bunch of the systems that I had actually been working on, because my primary advisor at Stanford was a guy named David Rumelhart, who created parallel distributed processing, had actually gone into depth with depth of computing, depth of data and everything else. And all of a sudden, these former systems, which were thought of as lightweight perception systems, ended up transforming into very interesting, cognitive, active, very capable systems on a really interesting curve. And so, dove back in, helped stand up OpenAI, helped stand up the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute at Stanford, participated, with the founders of the Turing Institute in London and other folks to try to do this. Plus, of course, working with all the heads of the commercial labs, because right now, a lot of AI progress is primarily being driven by when you have a minimum of 20 people up to about 150 or more working coherently on a project with tens of millions of dollars of compute. And that's, that's beyond the budgets and the teams of most universities, even though obviously there's super smart people there who are, deeply trained, deeply expert, deeply innovative. But there's a ton going on within the commercial realm.
Fantastic. Now, one of the things you've said, which struck me as ambitious, was that AI will be as transformative as electricity, which is pretty transformative considering that we would not be having this conversation without electricity. So I think you've dug back into AI probably now 5-6 years at this point, right? I think that's about the time
maybe
frame.
7 now.
Yeah. So how is your sentiment relative to that statement that as transformative as electricity? How has it been fortified? Are you less bullish about it over the last few years?
I would say that I'm more bullish that the curves, both sharp, linear up, and exponential, have continued. All exponential curves, J curves, ultimately turn into S curves, just a question of where, but that where really matters. And so we don't know where the S curve is fully yet on these things. And part of the reason I use the electricity parallel is because when you think about what electricity did in terms of transformation of all industries, right? It enabled the huge transformation of agriculture, but also brought women back in the workforce because it changed washing and other kinds of things as an angle for doing that, and it was just transformative across industries. And that's what I think you're going to see in AI as well, because in fact, we already know that software is transforming all industries, right? The notion of the bits transforming how atoms work, how they're patterned, how they're deployed, how they're maintained, how intelligently they behave and are configured. Well, artificial intelligence is somewhere between the magnification and the exponentiation of that, because all of a sudden you can start doing things where like it's self-programming, or it's programming without coders, and it's programming at a level of sophistication. So as one small parallel from years back in AI, to program a really good spell checker used to be something like thousands of lines of code, maybe even tens of thousands of lines, tons of debugging. And now with AI techniques, you can make a spell checker that's like with 300 lines of code or less, could even be 200 or 100, and works better than the old spell checker. And what's more, when you have things like, to get a lens into the future, what OpenAI and Microsoft are doing with Copilot and Codex in terms of amplifying coding, you begin to go, okay, what happens if in 2 years from now, you have a line of sight to making every developer, everything from HTML to C code, 2 to 3x more productive, every single one. What happens then?
Yeah. No, I totally hear you. Do you think, though, that, one of the criticisms that AI receives is it's the domain of the big tech companies only. So it's a technology that's only used by Microsoft, it's only used by Google, it's only used by Apple, Facebook, et cetera. And it's not really been democratized in terms of its use to the broader industry. Do you accept that criticism, or do you think it's just a phase?
Well, I definitely think that right now, the large model results are driven by intense compute, which typically is beyond most startups. Now, this is one of the reasons why OpenAI was started, because it wasn't just a question of humanity and society, which are very important and foundational to starting OpenAI, but also making sure that the tools of AI weren't only held by a small number of companies, which is one of the reasons why it's a 501c3, even though it has a commercial adjunct, it's particularly clever and all the rest of the stuff, but it's fundamentally for humanity as part of that. I think there's also, we got two other things that are in motion to that. One is, we have a very healthy and vigorous capital financing market. So there's a bunch of AI startups, many of which within the enterprise, but are being financed despite the fact that it is expensive and kind of proceeding. And then there are ideas about how to build AI technologies at much cheaper footprints. Because if you basically said, well, training models for interesting large scale AI models like GPT-3 and so forth are tens of millions of dollars minimum per model, although that's usually not startup land for doing this, minus the other venture capital point that you and I share the engagement in that. But that also is possible. So I think the criticism is a good point, but actually, in fact, has multiple points that are shifting it and making it available within startup land.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And hopefully through startup land, also available to other companies in the world where, American Airlines and Home Depot will be using AI for their products too.
Exactly.
Okay, so when we experience the use of AI or AI-powered tools today, they're generally in the digital world. Like, I do a search on Google, I get an AI result. Facebook guesses who I am based on my facial recognition. Apple, you're able to, unswipe and use a little AI to figure out that it's me. So a lot of those are really digital applications. the applications in the physical world have been a little bit slower, whether it's like robotics or self-driving cars or other things like that. And I guess my question is, why do you think that is? And will it continue to be that way when you interface more with the physical world?
So I think it'll always be a little slower because the learning speed within, call it the virtual world or metaverse or the software world or the internet world, all of which are, can be used as synonyms for each other or with slight variants, essentially allows a much quicker learning curve. Training of AlphaZero, AlphaGo by self-play against it can happen at a speed there. And as you begin to translate from that to the real world, you both have much more real consequences. You also have to learn that environment for it and ways of navigating it. Now, that being said, I actually think that that's part of the thing that will allow kind of very surprising and very good, kind of evolution. So, for example, you say, well, part of what happens with modern AI is it's a prediction machine and a categorizer. Well, like just as DeepMind did with protein folding and other things, you say, well, let's have that with vaccines, or let's have that with kind of disease therapeutics or other kinds of things. And you go, okay, once you get a rich enough environment that it can actually help do the search and the prediction and the categorization within, then you start translating that, do your safety tests. Obviously, that will always take some more time, but then you can begin to get a more rapid form of discovery and kind of creation than you did before. And obviously, I think you're going to see that in many, many areas of the physical world. And of course, for AI to have the transformative impact, paralleling electricity, you would need to have that, because obviously a lot of our industry, a lot of our life, all of our life is in the physical world in some ways. And so it needs to begin to do that in various ways. But as we think about it, more and more of our life is this intersection of, kind of the world of bits and the world of atoms. Here we are in this kind of virtual summit, in the virtual world, in a version of the metaverse. And obviously, as you began to, like, for example, say you had an AI assistant that was listening to this talk and would be calling up, oh, here's some interesting articles. Here's some people who disagree with what Reid's saying. Here's what some experts who currently think. And, that's all becomes really easy to amplify what's within our software metaverse world here, but adds a lot of quality to the knowledge work, to decisioning, to the learning that people are happening. And that obviously has real world implications. And eventually that turns into things working in the world too.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And I guess sort of as an homage to the title of this session theme of Robocalypse, a couple of years ago, this was a super popular topic, of course. And most people sort of envision the Terminator, right? There's like this physical embodiment of AI. It's a robot, and it's going to come after us and so forth. And I guess in some people's mind, I'm sure that continues to be a threat. There's another sort of dimension, which is that if you think about the AI permeating our physical infrastructure, there are things like data centers and power grids, communication systems, access to information that will all in some way be intimately tied with some element of AI. And I would guess that the theme of Robocalypse probably has a little more to do with the latter than the former. For one, I just wanted to check that I'm not on a different planet here, no pun intended. But when you do think about it in the context of these elements of physical infrastructure that we sort of need for everyday life at this point in an industrialized society, do you worry about that? And is that a risk that we need to think about in the adoption of AI?
Well, the classic kind of Terminator risk, I think, is a relatively low one. The so-called Robocalypse a la Terminator. One of the things that we do talk about substantially within the AI industry is what is known as the alignment problem, which is in the AI devices that you help create, that you may set the ground for them, a lot of intense self-learning. How do you get the behavior you expect? because obviously what we want to be doing is creating devices that help our humanity, help all of society, make things safer, more efficient, more productive, more fun, more joyous. And so how do you align to those kinds of goals in what you're doing? And in these enormously complex systems, one of the worries is you get the alignment wrong and you have a misalignment. Matter of fact, the subtlety in the Terminator movie actually, in fact, got that, because it was like, how do I protect human beings against attack? Well, I go invade all computer systems, and then they start attacking that as a virus, and that consumes humans are the people attacking the system, so we need to wipe out humans, and that would be a classic kind of misalignment system. And obviously, you would worry about that as you're clearly already having software well integrated into the control systems as the second part of your question. So how do you make sure that you do alignment well? Because, part of the thing is human beings do terrible things with each other. And, an AI weapon in the hands of a human being is more likely to be a damaging thing, all our infrastructure, than an AI, that's like, I'll be back, right, as a kind of a version. And so, they wouldn't be the Terminator robots and so forth anyway, but much more like infrastructure. So I do think that it's we have the general softwareification of everything, and you have the general, like, how do you create resilience and dependency and all the rest? Then you have AI on top of that, which has these complex systems, may have misalignment, may also have attack vector and defense vector issues. And all of that we need to be, of one stack to be, very attentive to, because it's easy to get something wrong in our more connected world. On the other hand, just like all technological progress, where you go, things might go wrong, there's huge things that might go right. So it's worth putting in the energy to saying, let's protect against the things that might go wrong. Like, well, should we wire up all the utilities to our software grid? And the answer is, oh, shit, someone might take them down, or some bug might take them down. It's like, yeah, but there's all kinds of virtues you get as long as you try to get the resilience and dependability and, kind of like not being able to take them down as part of it. It's just a crystal example.
Yeah. Before we leave this subject, though, I wanted to hit, one more, maybe more philosophical point, which is that, most of the tools that we've invented that are technological are just that, they're tools, right? They drive us around, or they give us power, or whatever. AI is the first tool that sort of reverse engineers in some way the way we think, right? And if you think about what is a human reinforcement function, right? Our human reinforcement function is the survival of our species, the survival of our offspring, the successful generation of our kind. And in some ways, if an AI system were to copy that piece of logic, it would presumably care more about its own survival of species versus ours. And so this is a little bit of a meta question, but would you agree with that statement or disagree?
Well, this is where the reason why all these things kind of go into this alignment problem. It's definitely possible to create a machine that, with a self-preservation fitness function, would go, oh, as part of my self-preservation, I don't care as much about human preservation. So unlike the Isaac Asimov laws of robotics, which don't strike, in current AI systems, don't strike you as with these self-learning systems as actually doable and preservable. It was kind of like the magic goes here. The positronic brain doesn't allow me to harm human beings. And actually, in fact, with misalignment, you could get various ways there. And that's why the positive version of that is considered to be alignment, which is, what are the ways that we can make sure that that a high attention to the value of human life and human health, is there. And part of the work that's going into that is to make sure that that is actually, in fact, like, what is that kind of AI safety? What does that kind of AI alignment look like? And I'd say that people know that when they say, well, we can have test harnesses, we can have that in our training data, we can try to reproduce that in various ways, but they are still trying to figure out ways to have like a more like a very highly robust sense of that. And that's part of the reason why there's AI safety conferences and other things that we go to and I help arrange and all the rest.
Yeah, yeah. No, that totally makes sense. Interesting thinking on this alignment problem. Just coming back to Earth a little bit, one of the several fun projects that you and I get to work on together is being on the board of Aurora, which is now a publicly traded company. And I wanted to ask you about the subject of autonomous vehicles. So obviously this segment of the industry has gone through quite the hype cycle. And, we started off with 60 players, we're down to 20 or something like that. There's been promises made of vehicle availability in 2018, 2020, 2022. And, one could argue that we're in a little bit of a trough of disillusionment for the industry. I guess my first question on this topic is, what is your outlook for the AV industry as a whole? Where are we in that cycle? And, realistically, when do you think we're going to see the actual commercially available systems around AV?
Well, this is one of multiple questions you asked me where you are equally expert to me in the answer, but I will essay a response. Look, I think that, I wrote a piece on LinkedIn a number of years ago about how not only is the autonomous vehicle world coming, but we should want to accelerate to it, that it would be a great thing. It would save tons of lives. It would make the use of our current infrastructure much more efficient. It would add a whole bunch of productivity. It would even have little pieces of rhetoric in the piece where, where drinking and driving would be considered to be socially fun versus despicable, as an instance for this. And it's a future that we should all want. And people say, well, what about truck drivers and so on? And it's actually, look, we have a massive shortage of truck drivers. We're 60K short now, or, maybe 150K by some measures. And so, there's a need for all that. I do think that actually, in fact, there's a lot of other ways. Just as when the automobile was created, it created the suburbs and everything else. And, there's a whole bunch of other industry and other location and other kind of activity that's unlocked by shifts in transportation that I think are there. And I think, it's funny because, this kind of trough of disillusionment is everyone's like, oh my God, it's going to be here next year. Oh, well, it's a couple of years off. Well, that's a long ways away. Right. And then all of a sudden it is here and it's working. And, as like Aurora already has, trucks driving from Houston to Dallas on, with FedEx and a pilot, it is here, it is present, Waymo is in Phoenix, and will be so much safer and so much more efficient in terms of use of generalization. And I think that it'll create a whole bunch it'll help us with our supply chain crisis, which we're hitting, kind of past the pandemic. And so I think that it's a very small N number of years now, such that we start seeing, because it's already on the roads, that we start seeing it beginning to scale and beginning to have a very positive impact on society.
And a couple of years down the road, what do you think the shape of the industry looks like? Meaning, how many players, how is it segmented, et cetera?
Well, part of the thing I think will be very good is I think the demands on safety and the demands on reliability will be very high. So I think it will be still relatively few players that have approached it kind of fairly seriously. Aurora is one. Obviously, Waymo, where Chris Urmson comes from, is another one. And I think that's going to be part of the effort. Now, I think part of the thing that, as because we've been in those discussions together as part of kind of Aurora, is like, actually, in fact, I think there'll be an intense start on trucks because tons of miles, needs for the supply chain crisis, how to navigate those kinds of safety concerns. And I think that's the kind of thing we'll see first, but I think we'll see it across everything as well.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And do you think, so, you and I have been on some of these rides with Aurora cars, and, when people ask me to describe it, I call it the magic carpet ride equivalent. It's just like, whoa. I think for a lot of us, there's still this sort of like weird feeling of like, do I feel safe being driven around by this thing? Do you think that feeling goes away, or is it sort of generational for people that interact with AI systems, where people that remember, like us, that remember the old world are like, yeah, I'm really more comfortable with myself behind the steering wheel. And maybe, the next generation or the one after that will be like, you were doing what? You were driving cars? Where do you sit on that balance of how people are going to feel about interacting with AI systems?
So I think it'll be sooner than generational, although obviously that's the extreme end limit. Look, today, anyone who's thoughtful like yourself and a bunch of other people about transportation knows that already when you get an airplane, you're flying in autonomous vehicles. That's essentially the way they run now. And really what you need to pay attention to is, just like, people who go, oh, but I'm afraid of plane flying. It's like, well, it's much more dangerous to drive to the airport than it is to get on the plane. So just pay attention to actually, in fact, what, actual safety protocols and kind of iteration looks like. And as that really exists within autonomous vehicles, it'll be like, no, I prefer to be in an autonomous vehicle. And those of us, obviously, who have been in a limo where you're clearly being driven by someone who's too tired or something else, I've certainly had that experience where you're like, shit, the car is weaving. I talked to another friend of mine who was like, who literally got the limo to stop and said, dude, get in the back, I'm going to drive. Right? Because you're like, fuck, right? Goes, well, I'd actually rather have the vehicle that doesn't get tired, never drinks, right? Has one concern, which is getting there safely, right?
So yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it'll switch over pretty quickly. Like, I do use my autopilot feature on the Tesla pretty regularly, and I have to say it's significantly less distracted than I am, no doubt. Couple more things I wanted to ask you. Obviously, a ton of innovation happening in the field. So much incredible academic work, work that's happening at OpenAI and a lot of other places, DeepMind. Of all the things that you see, because you see a lot of this, what gets you most excited? One or two things that say like, this thing is really special for me.
Well, one I already gestured at, which is the Copilot Codex, the coding side that OpenAI and Microsoft are doing together, because it's already looking at how do you amplify developers, how do you generate code. They're obviously, line of sight to how do you make your code safer, line of sight to how do you make it have less bugs, line of sight to how do you enable coders to be not just more productive, but actually much higher quality and a variety of things. And you just see a whole bunch of things that would come out of that. So that's definitely one. We've talked about autonomous vehicles, which obviously, huge number of the fatalities in the US and the developed world, is cars. And so, reduction of that, efficiency of the transport grid, all the rest of that stuff will be, I think, part of, will be an AI legacy, as it were. And then, I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that's around. Actually, I'll say one of them that I think is a fun, totally like roll the dice project. Just because we're trying to add some thinking and catalysts of spice. So as all of us know with the big language models, in terms of generating language, is that they kind of generate their own meta models for translational language. So training the first one, English to Spanish, like 7 days. These are all old numbers. Training the second one for Spanish to French is 3 days. And then, And then eventually it just becomes very easy where you get, Klingon translators and other kinds of things. So one of the nonprofit stuff that I funded, the Earth Species Project, is going to collect a whole bunch of data from chimps and also dolphins and everything else, and then try to line up these large meta language models against them and see if anything comes out. And wouldn't it be just awesome, right? If we go, whoa, we know how to communicate better with them now because we have Star Trek. It may not be a universal translator, but even anything would be awesome.
Yeah. Now I'll finally know how my dog feels about me.
Yeah. Well, Cosmo's devoted to your entire family. But Leo, you'll probably get into things like person who feeds me.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to my dogs a little more freely. Okay, good. So now I know you work a lot on the GPT stuff. So I'm going to ask you a specific prediction. When do you think we'll be reading a novel that is fully authored by AI? And I know you're working on a novel, so, but I think that one you're writing.
Yes. What length?
300 pages.
3 years.
3 years. Incredible. Incredible. Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll have that to look forward to.
Yeah. Let's have it as a we'll arrange one of our bottles of bourbon and we'll sit down and talk it through. Maybe reading it or reading it and wincing.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to do the sort of the blind A/B test. Read 2 books, see which one's written by the AI.
Yes.
The one where the humans die is actually the one written by the AI.
Oh, no. Actually, I think that the AIs will be trained to go, no, the ones where the humans win. Right. If you look at all modern science fiction, right, the ones where the humans die is like current Hollywood sci-fi writers.
Yeah. Very fair. Very fair. Good. Well, Reid, I think we're sort of out of time. It's always so fun to chat with you. You do, obviously there's so many good things that you've done, but all the wonderful work you do to make our society a better place. We all can't thank you enough. Thank you so much. Pleasure chatting with you. And hopefully next time we do this in person.
Indeed. Always fun.
Okay. Take care.
Ciao.